morning. Q&A. Q&A. I have a few questions that I've heard, but let's start with the live questions, and we'll get to those ones. How's it sound? What do you got for me?
You know, I mentioned to you yesterday, and you may want to say a little bit about that, you talk about the vegetation, how it, goes extinct you mentioned how much over the years, how much we've gone, and yet the earth is still maintaining itself.
Yeah, we mentioned that between animals and plant species, there are 200 that go extinct on average as far as back as we have actually measured, which is a couple hundred years. So that 200 species at one time, that's pretty incredible to think about that. But there is also, as we talked about last night, diversification that happens over time with plants and animals too. And so you do get a compensation to a degree for that. And remember too that modern efforts at conservation have actually tried to curb that, but they haven't been super effective. But that being said, we also don't know how many total species there are. It's not like we've plumbed the depths of the Pacific Ocean, and know everything that there is out there. We haven't measured all the different species of ants and beetles and things in the Amazon rainforest. So, there is some compensation for that based on both our ignorance and also diversification ability that God has given to different animals and plants. Jeff?
The extinction of species surely has escalated, I would think. The first couple thousand years, you probably didn't have a lot of animals going extinct. Whereas you get into time, that you've talked about, the earth wasn't designed to last millions of years.
Yeah.
And so that would make sense that over a period of time, that extinction rate is going to climb.
Yeah, to a degree. You remember at the beginning, before the flood, they were prohibited from eating animals. They were supposed to eat plants. And after the flood, they were of course able to eat animals. And that's where it seems like there's this kind of hostility between people and animals that enters into the picture. You no longer have animals talking to people. You have animals running from people, and oxen goring people. It's one of my favorite laws in the Law of Moses. When oxen gore people, what do you do? So yeah, there definitely is some fluctuation, some degree to expect some fluctuation. After the flood, there probably was to a degree a supercooling effect when you tear up the earth in the way that the flood did. When you open up the windows of the sky, as we see with the flood, you have a lot of water at one time covering the earth, the entire earth. And then all that water has to dissipate. Water has a unique ability to cool us off, right? Right here. Water has a unique ability to cool us off. So if you have a lot of water, what do you have? A lot of cooling off. And in order for all this water to just come up from kind of the crevices of the earth, the aquifer basically pouring forth, we have to have a lot of water coming up. And that causes that cooling effect. And that cooling effect is probably why we can find animals in ice, because of this cooling effect. So during that period after the flood, you probably do have a really high extinction rate, especially for cold-blooded animals. Cold-blooded animals cannot escape that supercooling effect. And so what kind of animals, by and large, do we refer to as dinosaurs? Reptiles. Reptiles are cold-blooded, and so they would have a harder time getting away. And that's why when you look at dating methods, you'll oftentimes see that mammoths come along a lot. They come along a lot after you have the reptiles, because the mammoths are warm-blooded creatures, and they're able to regulate their body temperature a little bit easier than reptiles. If reptiles are in the cold, their body shuts down. Jeff?
I read that they found the mammoths frozen, still
Yep.
have vegetation in their mouth.
Yep.
It means it happened pretty fast.
Yes, yes. That's not just in ice though. That's in rock strata too. So that would be, of course, the flood, right? The flood, huge waves of water. Somebody's in the process, some animal, some creatures in the process of eating another animal, and that just gets killed, and they get kind of frozen in time like that. Really cool fossils that come as a result of that.
Also, you know, it says that the water was over the whole earth.
Mhm.
You got the poles too.
Yep.
The water was over, and it is good possibility that that could have. I don't know if there's ever been any theory what time of year the flood was supposed to have happened.
I think it would be hard because of the change in calendars. There's changes in calendars for the Israelite calendar. You know, lest we get into too much politics, global warming right now, there's a lot of debate about that. I'm not going to take a stance on that, but there's obviously a lot of debate on it, right? And so when you think about the cooling effect, the super cooling effect after Noah's flood, that is tapering off still. That's how catastrophic that was. And so actually, a lot of people would say that we're in a cooling period. A lot of scientists would say that we're in a cooling period. So a lot of debate about that. But if we are in a warming period, that makes sense because of the flood. If we're in a cooling period, that's easy enough to understand too, based on the tilt of our Earth, based on the regulation of seasons. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. So probably not the best place to dump a bunch of legislation to try and control things beyond us. Jeff?
Have you read, one creationist wrote a book years ago about the Noah flood theory? His theory, which it sounded reasonable, was that during this process, God even tilted the axis of the earth. I don't know if permanently or temporarily, but that would have completely changed climates from one place to another as well. It seems to fit in to all the things.
It's a theory, yeah. Noah's flood is hard. You know, oftentimes we learn by principle of analogy. We compare one thing to another. We can't do that with Noah's flood. We have local floods, but we don't have global floods. It only happened one time. So how do you measure something like that? You know, could it be that all that tectonic shifting kind of tilted the earth? Maybe. But it's hard scientifically to envision an earth that's not tilted. Because the tilt actually regulates a lot of different things that gives us what we need in a sense. So if the tilt is not there, so I would be maybe skeptical of that unless I actually read more about that. So the tilt actually is pretty important to a lot of different things. We'll talk a little bit about that in the sermon.
Said that there was no tilt beforehand. Pete talked about this possibility of it just cause more of the climate change that we see clearly did happen. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard that, the reversal of the poles. I've heard that before too. We'll talk a little bit about the tilt. The tilt is actually pretty precise. And to me, it's hard to expect an Earth without a tilt because of certain things that we'll talk about in the sermon.
We know that God was in control, and He could have flooded the earth without tilting it. He could have done whatever He wanted to do.
That's true too. That's true too. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I Googled last night, of course you can come up with 5,000 answers on that, but it said that 700 dinosaurs have been discovered and named, okay? So I went to see Noah's Ark, the replica, of course.
Yeah.
And they said that infant dinosaurs were put on, supposedly.
Yep.
I just wondered your thoughts about it because did they put eggs? Because if you get into some of the super big dinosaurs, Diplodocus and Supersaurus and all that, the weight, the weight is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, and I know Titanic sank, but I know God's hand was in this one. But still, I want to know your thoughts about how they got all these species of dinosaurs on this boat.
That's a good question. And I think inevitably you have to talk about there being baby dinosaurs or younger dinosaurs because Diplodocus and things are over 100 feet long, as adults. So you have to have younger dinosaurs. Now that being said, they're supposed to repopulate too. So they're gonna have to be able to repopulate at least soon after they disembark. So they can't be super young necessarily, because the whole process of the flood is about a year. So you know, you can have animals reproducing after a shorter time than us, but I think you can't quite have maybe eggs and things. I think you have to have a live creature, but I think it would have to be an infant or younger. Now, this may be helpful too. When we think of dinosaurs, we think of Diplodocus. You know, we think of Argentinosaurus, which is huge. Brachiosaurus. We think of these big monster dinosaurs. But there are also really small dinosaurs too. The average size for a dinosaur, an adult dinosaur, is between the size of a cow and a bison. That's the average size of an adult dinosaur. So the average size of a younger dinosaur would be maybe like the size of a sheep. So if you bring one, or a pair, right? If you bring a pair of representative kinds of different dinosaurs, you don't have to bring every different subspecies. You can bring one kind and they can diversify from there. Because God does build in diversification between, among different families and
Well,
kinds.
that answers the question about how many animals were taken. It wasn't every single.
No, I mean, you'd have to have kinds.
Kinds.
God created in kinds
Kinds.
in Genesis chapter 1, and they were supposed to reproduce according to kinds. And then in Genesis chapter 6, you have kind of the bringing of different kinds onto the ark. Remember, you've got swarming creatures, you've got the various different animals that are brought onto there. So you have to bring kinds.
Creepy things.
Yeah, so like, to give you an example of that, we talked about cat kinds last night. You could bring a cat kind in. You probably would bring a bigger kind because it's easier for bigger to go to smaller over diversification. So you might bring a lion, and over time you could create a house cat based on that, but it's still a cat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got another thought.
Feel free, feel free.
Okay, you talked about Marco Polo.
Yep.
And the people who wrote things, Pliny the Elder, Herodotus, whatever these,
Herodotus.
how do the scientists view this? Do they just disregard it because that is written documentation? Do they think they just made it up? You question facts, you know. I don't know how to say that.
Well, there's a lot that goes into that one. So from the standpoint of professors and academics, there are a lot of pressures on them to toe the line. And so grant money, you know, if you espouse something different than the common agenda, then you're gonna get denied grant money. You know, you're gonna get denied tenure as a professor if you challenge that. So there's a lot of social pressures that play into that, a lot of economic pressures that play into that. And then also, you know, what the public doesn't know won't hurt them. So just because academics may read Herodotus, you know, most people here probably have not read Herodotus. And so, you know, it has to do, I think, a lot with like grant money and pressures like that that play into that. But they say what they say. You know, I mentioned with Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, section 8, he distinguishes between snakes and these big serpentine creatures that can devour elephants. It's clear that he's not talking about anacondas. He's not talking about pythons. He's talking about something much bigger. Kate, did I see you raise your hand? Not yet? You got a question? No, I know you do.
For third graders.
You got any more?
Not yet, but
Bring it. Bring it. Chris.
Me and you talked about the distant starlight stuff, how things are happening hundreds of thousands of light years away.
Yep.
And with the Earth only potentially being 6,000 to 8,000 years old.
Yep.
How do you explain that to somebody with it being so far away?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of these are good questions, so I appreciate you guys asking them. In Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, when God is creating, in verse 14 through 19, he creates the stars. And he creates, in particular, the planets as well. But the stars are kind of the point of focus here. We have the greater light, which is the sun. The lesser light we take kind of for granted to be the moon because it reflects the greater light of the sun. Now, in verse 18, it says that they were made to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, and there was a fourth day. And this builds on the explanation in verse 14, that these are going to be lights in the expanse of the heavens, to separate the day from the night, and to let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. So God has a purpose for stars. It's not just aesthetics, right? Certainly they're beautiful, but it's more than just aesthetics. It's that they actually function for us. How do we measure a day?
Rotation of the earth.
The sun, right? The sun. How do we measure a month?
Moon?
Roughly. Yeah, the moon. And so we have our regulation of time in seasons, because every season's 3 months. All of that is contingent upon these lights that God has given to us. So the supernatural explanation for that would be that God made it work that way. Well, that's easy, but if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in the Bible, how do you get them to get closer to that, right? You can pose a couple different possibilities. Jason Lisle is somebody who's done a lot of research on this, so you may Google him if you want to. His name is Lisle, is how he spells his last name. And he has posed a couple different suggestions for this. The first one is gravitational time dilation, GTD. And what that basically is that we are in a very gravity-dense environment on our Earth. And so that slows down on light. It's like something's kind of hanging on light and causing it to go in slow motion. So outside of our little pocket of heavy gravity, out in the universe, you've got starlight going a lot faster. But by the time it gets close to Earth, it slows down a lot. That's an explanation. I am more persuaded, as we talked about, I think on Friday night, by the idea that the only way that we can measure the speed of light is by taking a round trip calculation. That's where we get that very fast kind of anthropic understanding of light. In the C for Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. But the problem with that is that when something travels and bounces off of something, it loses a lot of velocity. Whether that is a dodgeball that you're throwing against a wall, whether that is a car bouncing off of a surface, whether it is Chris running to catch a football and hitting a fence, for a little visual. Whenever something hits something, it slows down a lot. So light is very fast even after it slows down a lot, but the one-way speed of light, so in other words, the light that comes from the sun to the earth, one direction, would be extraordinarily fast. You may have heard this before. It takes about 8 minutes and 22 seconds, supposedly, for light to get from the sun to the earth. That's because the sun is 93 million miles away. It takes a long time for light to get there. That is based on the round trip speed of light. Light can actually go a lot faster in one direction. So that's kind of, I think, what I'm persuaded by. But there are other ones. If you want to research it more, Anisotropic Synchrony Convention, ASC, is kind of Jason Lisle's forte. And that's what he focuses in on. GTD, gravitational time dilation. Jeff?
I don't know how scientific it is, but you know, the chicken or the egg, which came first, and we understand from Genesis, chicken came first.
Yep.
And could that also be true of everything else that he made? You know, if he put the stars there, and the light was already there by his design,
Yeah.
and then it continued from that point on.
Yeah. Well, and remember that understanding of space is kind of expanding too. You may have seen news headlines recently about James Webb Telescope overturns Big Bang hypothesis, something like that. They're finding out that the creation of galaxies can actually occur a lot faster than they used to think. That's going to have bearing on light speed, that's going to have bearing on relativity, it's going to have bearing on pretty much every facet of planetary physics. So get ready for entire paradigms to be shifting as we understand more about space. We're in kind of that era of Galileo versus Copernicus. We're in that era right now, and we'll see how it goes. Not you, Katie. You ain't got nothing? Jeff?
You talked a little bit about, I think it was Friday night, the new evidences that point toward two parents. I'm assuming you're talking about some of the more recent DNA research that's going on.
Yeah.
And it's pretty amazing. A lot from going backwards, even going forwards.
Yep.
They predict that mankind at the current rate won't last another 2,000 years. I mean, we don't know what might change from that or what God's design is.
Yeah.
But just reading the DNA from backwards to forwards, it's pretty fascinating.
You see mutations going
Sure.
and passing around for sure. So two things that you may be familiar with: the Human Genome Project mapped out the human genome. It's a big process. That's actually where people started making this chimpanzee-human connection on the DNA level, because supposedly chimpanzees and humans share about 93% of their DNA. There has been new research since then, because it's been quite a while since the Human Genome Project. There is a newer project that was called ENCODE, and that acronym stood for Encyclopedia of DNA Elements. They went back and tried to understand more of the human genome, and they found out that it's not even close. It's not even close to how much is shared. Now, that being said, it would make sense that we share certain DNA elements with chimpanzees because we exist on the same Earth. We eat a lot of the same stuff. We do a lot of the same kind of stuff. We climb on things, we sit on things, we stand, we walk, There's a lot of things that we do that are similar. We also share a lot of DNA with lions. We also share a lot of DNA with lizards because we exist on Earth. And there are only certain combinations that work. And so it's not even close to what they thought, though.
Yeah, you would think there'd be certain DNAs that would be consistent among all
Yeah.
across the, spectrum.
Yeah.
Whether it goes to plants, to animals, or whatever.
Well, we're mammals, Mammals would share similar DNA elements because we're mammals, we're warm-blooded. Yeah, we have hearts, we have livers, we have, spleens, whatever. So there's a lot of sharing, but it's not even close to what they thought. That Human Genome Project, actually, and I'll talk about this in the sermon too, I plan to. They hypothesized that there actually was a lot of junk DNA that was left over from the evolutionary process. So like your tailbone was a leftover, from your tail that you had. And they studied this more, and they started realizing that this junk DNA, this useless DNA, actually had a lot of reasons for its presence. It actually was still active and still useful and still usable. And so the more we study these things, the better off we've gotten. There was like 6 or 7%, according to the Human Genome Project, that was just complete junk. We didn't even need it. And then ENCODE discovered that pretty much gave a reason for all of that in the past 20 years. So
Well, that's according to me.
yeah. Now ENCODE is a lot closer to the biblical picture. The Human Genome Project, not as much. That was more Darwinian. Randy, did you have something that you were thinking of?
Maybe. I guess back to the, things I was asking you earlier, back to the dinosaurs and the Bible, is there, and this would be a believer's understanding, I guess, there's just the references to behemoth, and is there any other references that are specific? Is general ideas, like you went back to Genesis 1, the sea monsters. I think that was your version.
Yeah.
Anyway. But my idea has always been, there's not a lot of dinosaurs. The movies make it seem like, "Eesh, they're everywhere."
Yeah.
Or some of them at least do. Does the fossil record bear anything out as to where certain dinosaurs are found? I mean, the fossils. I would assume if extinction is the reason they left, or something like that, it would be similar to every other animal. In other words, we don't find elephants in every country in the world.
Yeah.
And so dinosaurs didn't run rampant through David's kingdom. We don't read about that. I assume that would be a correct assumption from just reading the Bible. There's no mentioning of the behemoth and the Leviathan. God mentioning those is not the purpose of saying, "Oh, watch out for these dudes."
Yeah.
He gives it for his creation point. Is that an accurate?
So a lot of the dinosaurs that we find here in the United States, we find out west. And the reason for that is the same reason that we find a lot of manuscript evidence in Egypt. It's hot and it's dry. It's hot and it's dry. Because wetness destroys. So we find a lot of documentation. I'm going to use this as an analogy, so I promise at some point. We find a lot of manuscripts not around the Nile Delta. We find them out kind of in the desert. Same thing for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Where are they found? Kind of out in the desert, right? Because it's dry and it's hot. It preserves things a little bit better. So we tend to find things where it's dry and hot. But that being said, cold-blooded dinosaurs, generally speaking, are going to have to stay in warmer environments. It's like if you go down to Florida, you'll see an abundance of lizards. You don't see as many here because it's cooler. So you're going to see them, you would expect them to live closer to the equator.
It's the same as now.
Yeah.
Animal species today, animals.
Yep.
There's certain animals that live under the ice where others can't.
Well, and like woolly mammoths are warm-blooded, they're hairy, they can live up in Canada. But you're not gonna see like crocodilian up in Canada because it's gonna struggle with that cold environment. So there is some degree of flexibility, but Herodotus and Pliny and others, they're in Greece and Rome and Israel. Josephus would be in Israel, and then in Rome. So you've got people around the Mediterranean Sea that are seeing these things too. So there's some, widespread existence, but also Noah's flood kind of throws things all over the place. So it's hard to measure that out. Preston.
Have you read any arguments about, they talk about the day being 1,000 years, a lot of people believe that days weren't like they were today.
Yeah.
But then you talk about the Sabbath.
Yep. Yeah. So you don't have the sun or the moon created until a little ways into creation, right? About halfway through the creation week. That's how we measure time. But the same word, yom, that describes a day, from that point onward, is the same word that describes a day from the first few days. Yom. So in the same context, within, 28 verses, I think Genesis 1 is, you've got day being used consistently the same way. Now, does that mean that the first few days are 24-hour periods? Yes, I believe it does. Because whenever you have God described as creating, he creates in 6 days. And the Sabbath observance is a 24-hour period. in Exodus 20 and verses 8 through 11, and Deuteronomy 5 and the restating of the law. They are to observe the Sabbath for a 24-hour period. If a day is not really a day, and you're going to have to observe a Sabbath for a billion years. So good luck, right? Good luck. So a lot of that gets extrapolated on this idea that a day is like 1,000 years to God, and 1,000 years is like a day, which is stated in the prophets and restated in the New Testament. But the point of that is not to say that time is irrelevant to God, but that God exists outside of time. God functions in time. So Galatians chapter 4, or at least sometimes he functions in time. So Galatians chapter 4 verse 4 says, in the fullness of the times, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. God functions in time. When God created the earth, he functioned in time. And so he is not ignorant of time. Time is not irrelevant to him, but he is superior to time. That's what the point of a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day for God. In addition to the actual point of that passage, which talks about God acting in his own time. He will act when he acts, and that's how it is. So, yep.
Also, we could point out, today we have our months of 30 to 31 days,
Yep.
week 7. Where did we get that week 7? Think about that. It goes all the way back to the creation.
Yeah.
About a 7 right there.
And you can see that throughout ancient mythologies too. Ancient mythologies will tie it back to 7. 365 is often connected to Enoch. I don't think that's a legitimate connection, but it is by some people. So, because he lived 365 years before the Lord took him.
Was that what it?
Yep.
Sorry, I forgot.
Yep. It doesn't really help us on a leap year, but yeah, it's a year is actually about 365 days and about 6 hours, give or take some minutes. But that's why we have our leap years. What else? Go ahead.
Good morning. Since we seem to have the Big Bang Theory, that evolutionary stuff institutionalized in our children's education,
Yep.
what is happening outside of that to bring the truth into the years that our children are educated? I know there's a lot of pressure for man to continue to get paid, so they can't go against the truth even if they believe it.
Yeah.
So it's what's happening outside of that.
Well, you're having a lot of scientists start collecting together and form their own institutions and their own institutes to try and help with that. So the Discovery Institute in Washington is a think tank of people who believe in intelligent design. They're not always necessarily God believers, but they're people that ridicule the randomness of Darwinian evolution. So you're starting to have some collections of people in different places that are helping with that. They're producing literature that's helping with that. I think it's our responsibility as parents and grandparents and influencers to try and combat that, but it's everywhere. We've talked about that. It's literally everywhere. You can't go anywhere on vacation without it being fed to you somehow. You can't go anywhere in any post-secondary or secondary education without getting it in your face. So I think it's our responsibility to have our children be aware that there is that explanation and to see faults with that explanation and be able to pick that explanation apart and also be able to uphold the biblical truth. It's our responsibility to make sure that our children don't become indifferent, to say that it doesn't matter, because it does. So ultimately it starts in the home. That being said, don't throw all, public schooling under the bus. There are a lot of great teachers, right, Kate? And there are a lot of really conscientious people who are doing exactly what they can. But there are also pressures, right, Kate? I mean, there's pressures. And so it's an uphill battle sometimes. And that has to do with funding, that has to do with grant money, that has to do with a lot of different things. And so we have to be aware of that. But there are really conscientious teachers in the public school system that are doing fantastic things too, and that do the best that they can to influence people towards a biblical model. Right, Keith?
It's not easy, but yeah.
Because there's pressures.
What is the standard public school teaching of the evolutionary ideas and all this? Is there specific courses where that's all I like? Back in my day, I don't remember ever being spoon-fed evolution or anything like that.
I mean, I think if you take any physical science or biology class, you're going to get hit with it.
Is it certainly it's changed. I remember when my kids went to school, I would walk in, if I was ready to go to school, you'd see random pictures of the old chart, where the different times of the different men, the Neanderthals and all the way back to the 8th. Is that stuff still believed?
Yeah, it's taught as fact.
In that way?
It's taught as fact now. I mean, it's everywhere. It's going to be in your basic biology classes. It used to just be in like evolutionary biology classes in college.
Yeah.
But now it's trickled down, even to younger kids. Rusty.
How do they get around the fact that Adam named all the creatures? He was the first man. He couldn't have been dumb.
One of the common criticisms of that is that Adam would not have been able to do that in a 24-hour period. So remember, he does it on the 6th day. But God creates in kinds. He doesn't have to name every subspecies. He can name a kind. Cat, dog, bear, let's call it a day. We're done. So he can name a kind. And, whatever language he spoke, whether it was Hebrew or something earlier, that's what he called it, and that's what it was.
What I was getting at is that, when you was growing up, you had the caveman, lived in cave, they couldn't, all they did is say, and they invented the wheel. From Adam, when did they get stupid?
Yeah.
Don't tempt me, Rusty.
Well, we live in houses made of 2x4s and sheetrock, overwhelmingly, or apartments made of sheetrock and 2x4s. They didn't have that back then. Where would be a natural place to find shelter and fresh water? A cave. So, living in caves as of a couple hundred years ago was in vogue. So, not too bad. I did have one question I want to get to that was given to me last night, and that's all we have on the whiteboard. So this had to do with top to bottom fossils. And one of our members from TR that was visiting last night was talking about that. And she was curious about what that means. So I'll give you an example of this. I'll try to make it a little bit easier. Darwinian evolution has to start down here with a little one-celled organism and magically poofed into existence. This one-celled organism has to use asexual reproduction because guess what? The dating market's very lean, okay? So it has to create multiple things like itself. Over time, this creates other things that start looking a little bit different. And eventually, you work your way up to all sorts of different things that eventually bring us to where we are today. Where you've got tadpoles, and you've got frogs, and you've got lizards, and you've got fish, and you've got birds, and you've got mammals, and you've got all these different things. So we start from the bottom in evolution, and we go to the top. That is not what we find in our fossil record. In our fossil record, what we find are advanced organisms that are very different. They are diverse from the start. Okay? So instead of having bottom to top, which evolution would want, we have top to bottom. So we have cats, and we have dogs, and we have bears, and we have horses, and we have bacteria, and we have all the different, kingdoms if you want. If you want to break it down that way, whatever. But there's diversity from the start. And then we go down and we create different species and subspecies. So for the cat, we have a house cat now. We have a tiger now. We have a lion. But guess what? They're all what? Cats. For the dog, we have a weenie dog. We have a wolf. We have a Great Dane. But guess what? They're all dogs, canids. We don't think wolves tend to be as dogs, but they are. And then bears. You have a polar bear. You have a Kodiak bear. You have a black bear. But guess what? They're all bears. I think we're on horses now. So for horses, we have Clydesdales. Big, huge horses. We have little pygmy horses. And we have, in the fossil record, there are some horses that have split hooves. So we'll call this the split hoof record. Split hoof horse. Then we have bacteria. So you leave your meat out. What kind of bacteria does it grow? E. coli. You get surgery, but they didn't clean the instruments off first. What kind of bacteria do you get? Staph. You get some bad chicken. What kind of bacteria does it have? Salmonella. And these things diversify over time, top to bottom. So with staph, over time, we shoot as much broad spectrum antibiotics as we can at it. And what does that result in? MRSA. MRSA is a response to what we have done to this bacteria. So this branches off into MRSA and just your regular Staphylococcus aureus, SA, okay? It diversifies. But diversity is present at the top, and then smaller changes happen over time. You go from big changes at the start, small changes over time. Evolution says smaller changes over time create bigger changes. It's opposite. So one goes like this, one goes like that. Make sense? Go ahead.
You kind of see that like with COVID, like you had COVID and then you get all these different variants.
Yep.
That's kind of like the same thing sometimes.
Don't poke the bear. Don't poke the bear. Yeah, they're finding out very quickly that if you got the original strain, you're actually going to be in a better position than moving forward. But if you didn't and you get one of these variants, you can catch all the variants because you didn't get the original. That's political too, so that's as close as I'm getting to it. Time is up. All right. I'm glad we had a lot of questions. So if you have any lingering questions, feel free to ask those afterwards. We'll talk about the study of the human body and the earth after and worship.